So, if you don't already know this, a few weeks ago, I decided to make a video talking about the rise and fall of Skylanders elemental gates, and I can firmly say that that video was a pretty big success. But while I was perusing through the comment section of said video, I would spot a certain thread that caught my interest. It would start out with one of my mods making a joke that I'm running out of content, which I'm surprisingly not, all things considered, and within the replies, someone would joke that I would one day cover the rise and fall of the bounce pads. When I saw this comment, I was immediately perplexed, the sole reason being, how the hell would I even cover something like that? And because of my own curiosity, I decided to look at the mechanic and see what I could learn from it, and much to my surprise, there is actually so much more going on with these floor springs than I thought. Out of every mechanic in this series, the bounce pads managed to not only stay relevant, but they also managed to do the one thing that many pieces of the franchise failed to do: thrive without any problems. This isn't going to be a review of the bounce pads because 1, how the hell am I even supposed to do that, and 2, I've only experienced half of them and watched the other. So instead, this is going to be more of a documentary of what the bounce pads are and how they changed. So that's the plan for today. We are going to take a look at the bounce pads within every Skylanders game and witness their evolution over time. So let's get moving. Before we hop into how the bounce pads evolved throughout the franchise's history, we first have to understand what world they were introduced to. Not as a franchise, or even a universe, but as a game and its mechanics. Now, if you hopped into Skylanders around the time that I did, i.e. Skylanders Swap vs. Trap Team, you probably wouldn't have known that the concept of jumping was actually pretty new to the franchise. Turns out for both Spyros Adventures and Skylanders Giants, the player could not jump at all, at least on their own in the mainline versions of these games. But since that would make for some very boring looking levels, the designers had to find a way to get Skylanders from one elevation to another that doesn't require a ramp of some sort. So enter the bounce pads, which were a major aspect of Skylanders' platform mechanic since they can each bounce you to a certain distance to reach higher levels. But that wasn't the only thing that they could do. That's right people, it's bug time. Back in SSA, some Skylanders who had movement abilities can actually combine their abilities with their jumps to move in ways that they really weren't supposed to, as in jumping over battle gates. But a lot of the time, the bounce pads had their own little battle gate lock things that stopped the player from doing this and forced them to actually fight the battle gate. The bounce pads also have some strange history when it comes to coloring too, since according to the Skylanders Wiki and actually seeing it myself in game movies, the PS3, Xbox, and PC versions of SSA all have alternate purple variants sprinkled around compared to the usual green ones, which are the only ones featured in the Wii version of SSA and Giants. Alongside them, there are also teleporters of the same shape across both games, but instead of being green or purple, they are instead orange and rarely blue. But to my knowledge, this doesn't seem to be version exclusive. All in all, the bounce pads were pretty solid mechanics for what they were, and they wouldn't really change or really be affected until Swap Force. Now, Swap Force did a lot for the Skylanders franchise when it came out in 2013 and brought a lot of innovation with it, both story-wise and gameplay-wise. One of the biggest changes being the fact that you can actually jump now. This meant that the Skylanders could have far more advanced parkour and platforming sections without the bounce pads, which was one of the primary uses of it. So you may think that the bounce pads would begin to get phased out at this point, but the bounce pads would actually go through a rather weird expansion during this time, and you'll see why in a second. Yes, they weren't as common as they were in the games beforehand, but bounce pads allowed you to get to extremely high areas that you just couldn't reach without them, so they still had a really large purpose within the game. They were also expanded upon a lot in terms of design and variation, since the bounce pads were often disguised as other objects, the ones coming to my head being the bog hog from Mudwater Hollow, the mushrooms from the training area in Woodburrow, and the beds in Ironjaw Gulch, alongside the musical beats from the same level. The big reason why those last two kinda stand out to me is because they both function like bounce pads, and we can argue that they aren't, but they also are tied to different in-game mechanics. Fun fact about those, if you're playing as any other Skylanders, the beds will break after you bounce on them 5 times, but if you play as a giant, they'll break after about 3, but it could be a 3-to-1 ratio. I'll just have to check as I'm recording. Getting back on track, however, the game would also introduce the launch pads, which instead of just launching you the moment you step on it, you actually have to click a button to activate them, mash a button before you could actually get launched, and they would transition you from one part of the level to another by either launching you straight to the next area, or by launching you onto a railing section. I will admit, however, that it's debatable if we should count these as the same since they are triggered in very different ways, but there is a compelling argument for both. But since we are pretty much done with the first Skylanders trilogy, it's about time that we witness their evolution through the second. The bounce pads, practically being a staple feature of Toys for Bob's Skylanders games, would obviously return in Skylanders Trap Team, so let's take a quick peek under the hood and see what we can find. Now, unlike Swap Force, where even I'll admit that they had less of a presence than they did in the last two games, the bounce pads come back in full force, to the point that they return to being a major aspect of platforming throughout the game. It's to the point where you pretty much encounter a bounce pad in every level, even outside of elemental gates, and even though Trap Team does cut the launch pad, it does introduce the Super Bounce Pad in its place, which I actually view to be the superior version of it. Yes, it doesn't have the charge up or the ability to launch you onto rail sections, since, well, they don't exist, and all you really need to do is step on them, but they basically use the main function of sending you from one point of the map to another in a more versatile and extremely flexible way. It's to the point where the designers were able to create a puzzle around them in Sunscraper Spire, which is really neat. So now it's about time for us to get into Skylanders Superchargers, where the bounce pads were basically kneecapped in the sense that they rarely appear. This was so bad that when I once again asked people in the Discord about Supercharger having bounce pads, many of us struggled to remember if they were actually in the game, but there are some instances, the most obvious being the Academy with the Super Bounce Pad at the beginning, and the bounce pads within the Spellpunk libraries, but outside of that, they are the only ones that really come to mind. What I'm basically trying to say is that there are way less bounce pads in Superchargers than before, to the point that many people barely recognize their presence at all, myself included, but they were still there. If I had to speculate on why this was the case, this may have something to do with the Supercharger gimmick, since it introduced a brand new form of gameplay. Remember, Vicarious didn't really use the bounce pads as much as Toys for Bob did, so they may have just used it less than they usually do to focus on the vehicle mechanic, which meant that was way less floor springs for us. So that just leaves us with Imaginators, and after looking through a few game movies and asking the Discord once again just to check, I can confidently say that the bounce pads return to their true form here. From what I saw, you can pretty much find a bounce pad in pretty much every level, and because of that, this is why I view them to be so resilient, because unlike a lot of things within the Skylanders franchise, they relatively stay the same. I mean, yeah, it's a basic mechanic that most players will probably overlook and not care about for the most part, but to me, it's kinda comforting to know that some of the old essence from Spyros Adventures still run throughout the whole franchise. Yes, the combat, the stories, and even the Skylanders themselves changed and warped over time, but the humble little bounce pad is one of the aspects that didn't really need changing since, well, it was already pretty perfect the way it was. But with all of that being said, this is where I'm going to end things off. But before we go, I would like to shout out those on the Discord for helping me out with this video through answering questions about the games that I haven't played yet, which, trust me, I'm finally going to do something about when I get paid in a little bit, and special shout out to Leon Winchester and Nate for making this all happen. So with that being said and done, thank you for watching. Like always, hit the subscribe button if you enjoy content like this, share this around so I can grow the channel, leave some comments down below to make the algorithm happy, check out Return to Skylands, its Discord, and a bunch of other stuff in the description below, hype up the video to spread it to the masses, and I will see you all in the next one.